Welcome everybody to chapter 3 of the complete Ruy Lopez Masterclass. Today we're talking about the Steinitz deferred. So this is e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop e5, and here black playing a6 and only then d6. The Steinitz being the immediate d6, so here they delay it by first playing a6. By the end of the video, you should be able to tackle these positions from the white pieces. We're going to talk about the theory that you need to know along with showing some example games, and as always, there is a PGN in the description for you to follow along and review afterwards. So let's jump in. The reason that black is inserting a6 before playing d6 is because they want to stop us from playing d4, right? If you recall, against the immediate d6, my recommendation in the previous chapter where we looked at this was the move d4. We strike instantly in the center. The issue though is that after a6 and then d6, we can no longer get away with d4 due to the fact that they play b5 and then they can take the pawn in the center, and we are unable to recapture due to this common trap known as the Noah's Ark, where we lose a piece very early on. So going backwards, we're not going to play d4 here against the Steinitz deferred. We're going to do the second best thing. We're going to play c3 and insist on d4 on the next move. Now, against this setup, there are 3 arrows that you see on your screen, and those represent the 3 most popular moves, but really there's only 2 distinct setups. As you'll see, the move bishop d7 very often will transpose to the move knight f6. We're going to talk about these secondary choices in the second half of the video, but we're going to start with the third arrow, this move f5. And the reason is because against c3, this move specifically is the most critical choice. Now, I will say that c3 is not the most popular choice here for white, so it's unlikely that your opponent is going to be specifically prepared for this move, but nonetheless, if they are, then they're probably going to play f5. This is black's best option when it comes to equalizing, and if they play precisely the next 10 to 15 moves of theory, then they are going to get an equal position. But I still think we can push in those final positions. There's going to be a move order trick that I'm going to introduce to you in the resulting position that I think gives white sort of a practical edge, and I think you're going to be able to play a fine game. So we're going to start with f5 because, like I said, it is the most critical choice, and the reason is because after we take, which we are going to do, they're going to take back, and they are taking advantage of the move c3, and specifically the hole that it leaves on d3. And it's rare for a black piece to be able to occupy such a hole so close to white's camp so early on, but here by means of f5 they are able to construct this idea, and after we castle they're going to plant the bishop on d3. Okay, now after we move the rook we have to do this. They're going to simply develop the bishop or the knight, and here's my recommendation. I recommend the move bishop c2, immediately questioning the bishop on d3, not letting it essentially terrorize our position, because ultimately, like I said, I want to insist on d4. That's not very possible with the bishop on d3. So bishop c2, challenging black's bishop, really their only active piece, and my claim is that after takes, we're playing d4 next, and we're going to get our pieces to active squares. Now again, objectively, if black plays the next phase of the opening correctly, they should be able to equalize. But again, there's going to be a nice trick that I'm going to show in a while. But what I will say is that if you dislike my recommendation, and I don't know why you would, I think it's a perfect recommendation, but if for some reason you want a move that I think the engine does approve of a little bit more, but I think it's way harder to play practically speaking, then I would recommend stopping and looking in this position, and specifically looking at the combination of the move rook e3, followed by the move knight a3, right? This developing scheme where the knight comes to a3, this I think the engine likes a little bit more, but again, I think it's super unnatural, and I think it's very difficult to actually play properly. So I like my recommendation, bishop c2 here. I think it's a very simple and fine game for white. Let's see how it progresses. So knight f6. We strike with d4, we have a lot of pressure on the center pawn on e5, so we are very much encouraging them, and really their only option is to push forward, and after we play knight g5, we are targeting the pawn on e4 yet again, so they have to defend it, and d5 comes to mind as the only option. So again, so far kind of forced, and here we play f3. We immediately challenge their center, and this is our idea, and this is where the energy from white's position comes in, because if you look at our queen side, Admittedly, it's not very impressive. Our pieces are struggling somewhat to come out. The knight can't come to c3, it can come to d2, but then it's stepping on the toes of the bishop. So there is some miscoordination that we have to handle, but on the flip side, we immediately try to address what we argue is black's overextended center, right? This idea of going knight g5 and really d4 earlier on is to lure the pawns to the center, which we can then target with f3. It's a very dynamic position. The way that it develops here is by h6, right? They kick away the knight to h3. They say that the knight is poor on the side of the board, and this is true, and here they castle. I will note they cannot get away with taking on f3, hoping that we take back and wreck our structure, because we can give this check, and at the very least we can give the check on f5 and then take with the queen, and we've solved two problems. We've taken back with the queen, activating it and not ruining the structure, and also we've of course made it so the black king will be forever stuck in the center. So they can't really take, they have to castle and allow us to be the ones to put more pressure in the center. After we play knight d2, we are threatening now this pawn several times, a bit too many. So now they will indeed take, but the benefit is by us being able to play knight d2, we can take back with the knight, and this is sort of the starting position of this f5 line, right? A lot of moves have been played, but I think it's very much forced and the natural continuation. And here, okay, there are some arrows on the board, so let me try to explain both sides' strategical battle, because it's a very fascinating one. From the black pieces, clearly the area that they are strongest is going to be this f file. It is a fully open file. The rook is already on f8. By playing f5, they've opened up that rook for them. So their strategy here is in some move order or another to play rook to f7, move the queen out of the way, likely to d7, and then stack the other rook behind it on f8, and just claim that the pressure they are going to exert on the f-file will guarantee them a fine middle game. On the flip side, clearly we're not going to be able to contest that f-file, and instead white will look to develop their rooks actively onto the e2 square and really take control over the only other open file being the e file. It's a very interesting battle, and it's a battle of which file essentially is more important, but here comes a really important detail. So I want to show this. Here, after rook f7, the main move, if you look at the database, and by the way, there are hundreds of games in these sort of positions, it's a very mainline theoretical battle, but the main move after rook to f7 is the move knight to f2. But the downside of knight to f2 is that after bishop d6, our bishop really struggles to find a pleasant home. It has to come to d2, and again, games have continued like this in the dozens. There are many examples of top players playing this for white, but I really don't like white's chances to push for anything. I don't think we have any reasonable chances, and I think black is not only equalized on the objective front, but also certainly on the practical end. So instead of knight f2, my recommendation is to start with bishop f4, and we're very likely then going to reroute the knight to the center and via f2 to d3, right? This maneuver I'm not canceling out, but I'm doing it in a different move order to give our bishop a much brighter future. So I think this is a nice move order trick, and it actually poses some concrete issues for the black player. So let's take a look at what happens. Now, after queen d7, following in their plan, there's already a pretty serious issue, which is this move bishop e5. And I think it's difficult from the black side to predict that the bishop, after coming to f4, will so quickly come to e5, but it's such a strong piece there. It is immune from capture thanks to the fork, and you point out the lousy coordination between the rook and the bishop. And meanwhile, it sits on e5 like an absolute monster, controlling the entire board. It is quite literally the strongest minor piece on the board. And again, very difficult for black to deal with. And I think that this maneuver, bishop f4 to e5, is the proper way to tackle these f5 lines. Let's take a look at how this could progress. You can see it's already difficult. If they simply ignore the bishop, guess what? We're bringing the knight in. We no longer have to go to f2. Thanks to the control of the bishop on e5, we also have a safe square on f4, so we don't have to worry about the rooks ever having contact. And meanwhile, the knight is coming to g6. There's already some ideas. Imagine if we can trade away the bishop on e7, then the bishop on e5 is genuinely going to be uncontested on the dark squares. And again, I really like this position. In fact, the rook, objectively, the best move is to move it away a second time, but you can see that black has completely failed to see their plan through of doubling on the f-file. Meanwhile, our idea is very much coming to fruition. We can double the rooks on the e-file, and we have very much won the fight that I was outlining earlier. Now, I will say that after bishop f4, the reason that I just showed queen d7 is because against knight f2, this bishop d6 and soon queen d7 is the main idea, right? Like I said, this is where the queen wants to go to double. But against bishop f4, it's not a very good move. So I want to look at probably maybe slightly better alternative, which is simply asking the question, hey, what if we quickly contest the bishop on f4 anyways? Well, here's my recommendation. We simply take that bishop. And the idea, so bishop e5, by the way, you might, be drawn to this. Does it still work? The issue is after queen d7, and we start doubling rooks, they can at some point take, and we're going to have to take back either with the pawn, which is not what we want. The pawn is actually going to be more of a weakness than a strength. It's isolated, and black has ample pieces to go and target it. And if we take with the rook, the issue is the rook starts to feel a little bit lonely. It is kind of disjointed from the other pieces. The knight comes to e4, where it's very much uncontested, and the fact that we've delayed moving the knight on h3 now becomes very telling because we no longer can move it to f2. So essentially, all of this is to say that if they immediately challenge the bishop after we go bishop f4 with bishop d6, do not go for the same plan thinking, hey, I have much control over e5, let's just put the bishop there anyways. Instead, my recommendation is to take the bishop, and here's the beauty of all of this. After they take with the queen, we go knight f2, and we get that exact same main line, which I'll show again here, knight f2 being the main move, and after bishop d6, bishop d2, we get this exact position, only with the bishops traded and the queen coming to d6, right? Let me show this on the board again. Bishop d6, we trade here, and then knight f2, same position, but the dark square bishops are traded, and I think anybody with a sense of positional mindset would understand that this was certainly an advantageous trade for the white player, because simply the bishop on d6 was super strong, targeting the dark squares in the position, and the bishop on d2 was probably white's poorest placed piece. So I really like this move order trick. I think at the very least, we end up trading our worst piece for their best, and at the very best, we get an improved and very much a monster piece on e5. I'll show how this can progress because I don't want to give the wrong impression that white is in any way objectively better here. I do think practically white has a good chance, largely due to the control over e5 and the lack of control that black has over the e4 square thanks to the knight sitting on f2, and I do think that the e-file is more fruitful due to the fact that the knight on f3 is blunting the f-file. So if black stacks on the f-file, that's actually not so effective, which is why their best option here is actually to switch mindsets and move towards the e-file. Now, there were a couple of games that continued from this position. In one game, black took with the queen, in the other one, black took with the knight, and in both games, they ended up in a draw. The game with the queen ended up in a very quick draw that both players agreed to. I think white could have continued pushing, arguing their major pieces with the queen and the rook are better placed, but nonetheless, they agreed to a draw. And with the game that ended in a knight, the take with a knight also ended in a draw after queen b3 and c5. And okay, the game continued here a little bit longer, but nonetheless, it ended up peacefully after this position. But again, quite early draws. I think at a club level and certainly anything, below 22, 2300, there's a lot of play left in this game, and I think white is better suited to get the better end of that play. So I think this is a totally playable option for the white pieces against this f5 line. I will mention one final note, which is some people might be wondering, okay, in this position, why start with rook f7? Let's stop the bishop from coming to f4 with the idea of after knight f2, then go rook f7, and we've transposed into the line that I don't like, right? If you recall, the line starting after rook f7, I don't recommend knight f2, I want this move order trick. But the issue is that after bishop d6, it's true that if we play knight f2, we're not getting a great position, but bishop h6 comes. And you can see how the knights here on h3 and f3 might look like kind of weird pieces, but they actually support a pretty dangerous kingside attack, as this line proves. Queen takes on h6, knight h7, and here the knight can come in, sink its teeth into g5, and there's no way to actually stop a crushing attack here. After queen d7, which is probably best, the rook can come to e6, and we're just adding pieces, and after the rook comes to e8 hoping to trade, we simply trade on our terms. And black is left unable to defend. After knight takes h7, we have a series of checks that end up winning the queen. Okay, so that covers the move f5 here, which again I think is the most critical. It's the thing you really need to know, and either take my recommendation of an early bishop trade and then a quick strike in the center, or try to play around the bishop with rook e3, knight e3, and so on. But that's kind of the main move you need to know against after c3, this move f5. This now takes us to the other options, which are knight f6 and bishop d7, and together these two moves are far more common than f5. So you might be wondering, how is the video so short from this point on? How am I going to cover these moves? Well, here's the beautiful thing. I'm not going to cover these moves because they have absolutely no independent value, and you're going to see these exact positions in future episodes. That's the point of kind of making a masterclass. I'm trying to be consistent, so I don't have to show you complete, unique recommendations against different lines, because the truth is, there's a lot of transpositional value. So let me explain what I mean. Now, first of all, the difference between bishop d7 and knight f6 is also not very significant. And the point is that after bishop d7, black still needs to decide how to develop their knight. If the knight comes to f6, that's going to transpose to lines where they first start by playing knight f6 and then play bishop d7 and bishop e7. The other alternative after c3 and bishop d7 is for them to choose to develop their knight actually via e7, where they're more likely to play g6 after d4 and then move the knight to e7 and the bishop to g7. But guess what? This transposes not to the knight f6 lines in this chapter, but rather to the g6 bishop g7 Smyslov variation that we're going to see in the next chapter. So in the next chapter, we're going to talk about the first move g6 here, known as the Smyslov. And here, guess what? Black develops their bishop and knight in the exact same construction, and then often plays d6 and develops the bishop. So these are just going to transpose, and in fact, you're going to see after d6 here, c3, bishop d7, you're going to get these exact same positions after g6. This exact position is going to be on the screen in the next chapter, where we're going to do a deep dive into this. So bishop d7 has no independent value. That should be clear. It either is going to transpose to knight f6 lines, which I'm going to talk about in a second, or it's going to transpose to lines in the next chapter with g6 and bishop g7. But what about knight f6, right? This surely is an independent move, and it is in the context of this chapter, but not in the context of this course, because in this course against an early knight f6, specifically before they develop their bishop on f8, with an early knight f6, my recommendation is sort of to meet that by going d3 and then playing in the typical Ruy Lopez main lines. Let me show you what I mean. In the first move, after knight f6 here, I'm playing d3, and in this position, black, if they wish, can play the move d6 and play very solidly and develop the bishop to e7. And the way that we play is by going c3, castling, doing the common knight maneuver, and then striking with d4. This is not the only position that this can arise. They can also choose to start with a6 and then go knight f6, and again we're playing d3, and then they choose where to put their bishop. They can either put their bishop on c5, and this we're going to cover in a different chapter, in the second to last chapter, or they can put their bishop on e7, which we're covering in the last chapter. So, okay, I know this is just a lot of organization of how the chapters are put. How does this relate to the video today? We'll take a look. When they choose to put their bishop passively in these lines on e7, which is the final chapter in this series, like I said, I'm playing for c3, and then I'm castling, doing the natural knight maneuver, bringing the rook, and looking to strike with d4. Now let's go back to the chapter at our hand here, which is this move d6 and c3 and now knight f6. It is clear that this bishop is not going to come to c5. Instead, it's going to come to e7, right? This is its only option for developing. And therefore, we're getting the same variations, where black is moving their knight and then playing this d6 bishop e7, this more passive approach. And remember, in the other positions, our pawn is on d3, and we're then going for d4. Here, this is even an improved version, because we can play d4 immediately, in one swoop. We don't have to waste a tempo. And therefore, after they play bishop e7, note they cannot take the pawn because d5 will ruin their day. After b5, bishop c2, we win a piece. So they cannot take the pawn on e4. They're going to have to develop their bishop to e7. But guys, this is exactly the same type of position that we're going to see in the final chapter. And so in order to not repeat myself and not force you to watch the same thing twice, I'm just going to refer you, I guess, to that chapter, because again, it's the same sort of position, only it's an improved version because we've already managed to play d4. I will note two things. First of all, if you want specifically some game examples in this variation where they've allowed us to play d4 immediately, then check out the PGN, because I do have some games if you want to go through them, but I argue that it's an exact same replica of what we're going to get in the final chapter, where my recommendation is rook e1, obviously this knight maneuver, if they hit us with b5, drop the bishop to c2, and chip away with a4, and we've just gotten an improved version of that up a tempo, and so there isn't a whole lot to discuss. White is clearly better here. Knight f6 is not a very aggressive move. f5 was certainly the way to go, and if they play knight f6, you're going to get the kind of typical mainline Ruy Lopez positions, up a tempo compared to the variations that I recommend against the main lines, and you should be good to go. Once I finish putting out the videos and you watch the final two videos, you'll understand and get a feel for these sort of positions, and you'll be able to also apply that knowledge to this episode. So I hope that makes sense. I'm essentially kind of killing two birds with one stone, and I think this is very typical for the Ruy Lopez in general because there's so much transpositional value. The point is, their developing scheme is identical to what you're going to see in that final chapter that I keep on mentioning, and therefore we're playing the same way with c3 and d4, but we're getting that up a tempo because they've not actually developed in the optimal way. They should have first played knight f6 before playing d6, which would have forced us to play d3 and then made it harder, therefore, for us to get away with playing d4. But because they've done this in a different move order, we're very happy and we're going to get very pleasant positions. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. Subscribe if you're new around here, like this video if you learned something new from it. If you have any questions whatsoever about this chapter or the masterclass in general, let me know down below, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.